Welcome. This is Bill Donahue with Discerning Truths. That's what I call my stream, Discerning Truths, where we normally talk about Jesus. And that's going to be true as we go through the Gospel of Mark. I'm starting out with, I always do the introduction. I look at the interrogatory questions, who, what, when, where, and why, before I look at any what do you call it, aspect of a book or a letter that we study, because I'm trying to get the context for where we're at, right? But sometimes, and every question, every interrogatory question's got underlying questions, like the who wrote it, who did he write to, right? Who are the main characters in the book or letter? Are there significant people, right? And who spoke the words that are being written here? Are they Jesus's words or the apostles' words or whatever? There's a lot of who questions underneath the who question. And then normally when I do an introduction, I look at genre, compositional devices, intertextual references, because they help set the context of the book. And some people think my intros are too long. They go, like I did a study of Philemon. It takes less than 10 minutes to read Philemon. I spent an hour going through Philemon. And they go, what kind of sense does that make to spend an hour talking about a book that takes 10 minutes to read? Because in that hour, we learned a lot more about Philemon, right? Than we did in just reading it. We dug deep. So in my introductions here, when I'm doing it, and it's going to be a two-part introduction because I can't get through all the questions and do the intertextuality and that in an introduction. I had to leave the intertextual connections to the body of the study, because even going two parts on an introduction, I couldn't get to them, right? And so with that, I'm going to get into our introduction to Mark part 1, and I'll do part 3 or part 2 on Wednesday, and we'll get going with that. So who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Okay, the Gospel itself doesn't have any named author. There's no self-identification like Paul's letters. He goes, "I'm Paul the apostle," or whatever. It has none of that. The early manuscripts and titles, when people copied it, they wrote according to Mark on them. And it identifies Mark, also known as John Mark or Marcus. He's the cousin of Barnabas and a companion of Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journeys from Colossians 4:10 and Philemon 24 and 2 Timothy 4:11. And Peter calls him my son in 1 Timothy 5:13. That doesn't mean he is his literal biological son. It means Peter was probably the person that helped convert Mark to the ministry. And John Mark is described as Peter's interpreter or translator or secretary who recorded Peter's preaching. He wasn't a direct witness. He wasn't an apostle, one of the original 12 apostles. And because Peter refers to him as my son, it probably means Peter was directly involved in his conversion. And John Mark, also called Mark or John sometimes, or son of Mary, is known from several New Testament passages and early patristic writing. Notice that patristic is the early church fathers, okay? And he's known as a Jewish Christian from Jerusalem. He's a relative of Barnabas, a companion of both Paul and Peter, and he's the traditional author of the Gospel of Mark. And the sources provide a coherent but limited portrait focused on his ministry associations. There's no birth or death dates are given, or details remain sparse about Mark in the Gospels beyond this comparison. And I limited what I was looking for biographical information to the earliest church fathers, the early church fathers. There are some later traditions about Mark that I didn't include that talk about where he died and that kind of stuff. They're so late that I didn't include them as credible. They may be right, but I just didn't include them. So who was John Mark? He's the son of a woman named Mary. There's a lot of Marys in the Bible, and there's a lot of people named Jacob that the New Testament translates those names as James. And so you got a bunch of people named James in the New Testament. You got a bunch of women named Mary. And it can sometimes get confusing to figure out which Mary or which James we're talking about, right? And then you also have that confusion where it'll refer to the same person by different names, like Peter or Cephas, right? And you know, so when Peter was miraculously released from prison during the persecution under Herod Agrippa I, traditionally dated about AD 44, he went directly to this house of Mary, where many people gathered. And that we know from Acts 12, verses 12 to 17. That household included at least one servant girl named Rhoda. You don't usually have servants unless you're a house of means, that you have some financial means. I've done pretty well in my life financially most of my life. I've had some setbacks, but I did pretty well. I didn't have servants. To have a servant in your house indicates a certain level of money. And so Mary, and we don't know Mary's husband's name, or the fact that it's listed as Mary probably means she's a widow, still had significant money. So Mark grew up with money. He's the cousin of Barnabas. We know that from Colossians 4:10. Barnabas was a Levite from Cyprus who sold property and gave it the proceeds to the apostles. We know that in Acts 4:37 and 38. Barnabas is also the person that introduced Paul to the apostles. He was the first one to vouch for Paul. And Mark's father is not named. And like I said, the households identify with Mary, which is consistent with her being a widow during that period. These details place Mark in a committed Jewish Christian family in Jerusalem from the earliest days of the church. Okay? And whether the whole family came to faith through Peter, their association with Peter, or uh, some other means, it's very likely that John Mark came to this thing through Peter. Now, John Mark's early ministry and his association with Paul and Barnabas we have from the Bible as well. Mark first appears in active ministry when he accompanied Paul and Barnabas from Jerusalem to Antioch after delivering famine relief in Acts 12:25. He then served as their assistant on their first missionary journey, beginning in Cyprus in Acts 13:5. The term suggests an official role, possibly involving practical support or teaching or note taking. You know, his note taking is echoed in later patristic early church fathers, patristic descriptions of the work with Peter. At Perga and Pamphylia, Mark left the group and returned to Jerusalem in Acts 13:13. The Acts gives us no indication why he left. I tease him that he was missing mama, right? But it doesn't say. Paul later viewed his leaving as desertion of the mission. Paul took a very strong offense to Mark leaving the mission field in Acts 15:38. When Barnabas and Paul were planning their second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take Mark again, but Paul refused. He didn't want anything to do with Mark. In the sharp disagreement led Paul and Barnabas to separate. Paul took Silas with him, and Barnabas took Mark and sailed off to Cyprus in Acts 15:36 and 39, and then we don't hear about Barnabas anymore. The chronicler of Acts, Luke, only focuses on Paul after Paul and Barnabas split. He's chronicling the gospel for a thing. I think both the gospel of Luke and Acts are what I would call friends of the court brief, that Luke is writing to an official in the court trying to make a case that Paul should not be put to death, that neither Jesus, the apostles, or Paul have done anything that should be considered a violation of Roman law or treasonous. Now, John Mark does later reconcile with Paul in his later ministry, and we also know this from the gospel. From the writing, the Bible. By the time Paul's first prison and imprisonment, probably in the mid 50s, some people put it as late as 60s, in 60 AD. I think it's clearly further back in the 50s that Paul's first in prison. Mark had been reconciled with Paul, and we know this in Colossians 4:10 because Paul greets the recipients and refers to Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, noting that instructions had already been given about him and urging them to welcome him if he came to them. Mark is listed among Paul's fellow workers. Similarly, in Philemon 24, Paul calls him a fellow worker. So, whatever the dispute was early on, Paul and Mark have reconciled, and Mark is actively working in the ministry. In 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul tells Timothy, Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me in ministry. Okay? This demonstrates full restoration of Paul's high regard for Mark's ongoing usefulness. And then we have Mark's association with Peter in the writing of the gospel. The New Testament links Mark closely to Peter in Rome. In 1 Peter 5:13, Peter writes from Babylon, and most commentators see that Peter is using Babylon as a code word for Rome. Okay? It's why a lot of interpreters of the book of Revelation and Mystery Babylon think it's talking about Rome and not some future thing, but actual Rome back then. It's because of the use of Babylon. And he writes, she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greeting, and so does Mark, my son. The affectionate my son indicates a close spiritual father-son relationship in the faith and ministry, right? This repeated reference to Mark as my son indicates, Peter sees him as the spiritual father. Now, when we go to the early church fathers, now Papias, he's early second century AD. Now, we don't have Papias's writings, but he is quoted by Eusebius in ecclesiastical histories. And he's quoting him, where he says the presbyter, that's a name often used of John the Elder, and said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered the things said and or done by Christ. Okay? Now, Papias doesn't argue that Mark's a chronological gospel. He's saying he wrote down what Peter said. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him. But afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teachings to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error when he thus wrote some things as he remembered them, for he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. So Papias says that Mark had listened to Peter, probably listened to Peter speak many, many times, had his speech memorized, basically. And so he wrote from memory what Peter said. Irenaeus, Irenaeus, you'll hear me mispronounce more words, a lot of words, if you ever listen to me for any length of time. I get garbage from an online listener because Rene Descartes, whose name spelled like Descartes, is I've often said his name is Descartes. It's French names are different, and so I out of habit mispronounce his name, and I get a lot of garbage from somebody for that. Hang around, you'll hear me mispronounce plenty of names. And Irenaeus writes, after their Peter and Paul's departure, after their death, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. So he's saying he didn't write it while Peter was still alive, but after he wrote it. Okay? And he's writing in about AD 180. Clement at Alexandria, late second century, possibly early third century, also preserved in Eusebius in ecclesiastical histories, wrote the gospel according to Mark originated when Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome and declared the gospel by the Spirit, and many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly forbade nor encouraged it. Now, that indicates that Mark wrote the gospel before Peter's death. So there's a little difference between Irenaeus' account of when the gospel is written. Either Peter's still alive and has signed off on the gospel, or it was then after he was dead. But either way, what we have is that the Gospel of Mark is actually the Gospel of Peter according to Mark. And Eusebius records a received tradition after writing the Gospel in the Roman context. Mark was the first sent to Egypt. He proclaimed the Gospel he had written and was the first to establish churches in Alexandria. Again, that's from ecclesiastical history. Eusebius presents us on the basis of what they say. That's earlier writers, right? And links it to the succession of bishops in Alexandria, naming Ananias as the first bishop after Mark. Okay. This tradition is consistent with Mark's mobility, starting in Jerusalem, Antioch, Cyprus, Rome, possibly Egypt, and his role as an evangelist carrying the written gospel, and no further details of his work or death in Alexandria appear in the earliest sources. Like I said, they're later. No early sources provide information on his birth, his exact age, any physical description, his specific teachings beyond the gospel link his or his marital status or his manner of death. All of that is later tradition, right? And they come out of Coptic sources. Coptic is a church generally out of Egypt, okay? And some Coptic sources they exist, but they fall outside my criteria. What I'm trying to do is limit what we know about John Mark to what the Gospels or the Bible says and what the earliest church fathers wrote. And that way I'm trying to get rid of as much tradition as possible and keep it to what the facts, you know? So who was the gospel in Mark written to? It's primarily written to Gentile, non-Jewish Christians with strong evidence for a Roman or a Roman context setting. Internal support includes explanation of Jewish customs, which makes sense if it's written for outsiders. You wouldn't have to explain a Jewish custom if you're writing to Jews. If you're writing or preaching and writing down the words of Peter, Peter wouldn't have had to explain Jewish customs if he was talking to Jews. In Mark 7:3 and 4, it says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders." You wouldn't have to tell that to a Jew. The Gospel of Mark also translates Aramaic phrases into Greek. Like in Mark 5:41, it's Talitha Kumi. And what that translates is, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And in Mark 15:34, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing every one of these words. And are translated, and less emphasis on the Jewish legal fulfillment of genealogy, like in Matthew. Matthew's very much into genealogy. Patristic sources, that's early church father sources, explicitly tied the writing of to Peter's preaching in Rome and requested the Roman hearers from the request the Roman hearers for Mark to write those to put those writings, those teachings in writings. Okay. Luke in Acts describes Peter as unlettered, and a lot of people think that means that he could not read or write. If Peter could not read, he clearly was a good listener because he has a good knowledge not only of Jesus's teaching, but of the law and the prophets, and also of extra biblical books that are mentioned in Jude and Second Peter. So he was either through oral tradition being there. Unlettered may mean something less than totally illiterate. He may not have been able to um, write and clearly, or been not well schooled, but could read and write, right? Unlettered, that he doesn't have a known education, but he's there. Mark, growing up as somebody of means, was probably well educated, may have had the ability to not only speak Greek, but also Latin, which would have been real helpful preaching in Rome, right? It'd be great to have him. If you have somebody that speaks Aramaic, possibly Hebrew, right? Because he's a good Jew from Jerusalem, he may have known the formal study language of Hebrew as well as the general language of Aramaic. Greek is the lingua franca, the language that everybody in business spoke. And then you have his possibility of him knowing Latin would have made him a great scribe and a note taker, and very, very helpful if you're preaching in a country where Latin is the native language, right? So while the Gospel of Mark includes other characteristics, always asking who's the significant people in the Gospel, right? This is my other who question. There's other people in the Gospel, but the book is about Jesus. Jesus is portrayed as the Son of God, revealed at his baptism, his transfiguration by the centurion at the cross. He's received as the Messiah, an authoritative teacher, a miracle worker, and as the suffering servant whose path leads to the cross and resurrection. John prepares the way for him. And I'm going to show you that actually what John is quoted, what Mark quotes about John from Isaiah is actually saying, prepare the way for Yahweh. It's a strong declaration that Jesus is God in human flesh. The disciples are key persons in the story, especially Peter. But how Mark presents Peter, he's prominent, but often shown as failing or rebuked. This is consistent. Who's your biggest critic if it isn't you? Peter is telling his story, but he sees his own failures more acutely than anybody else is going to see it. Paul's seeing his own failures as more acute. I see my own deficits more acutely than other people do, right? And maybe you see your own failings the same way. So the fact that Peter's presented, and so his failings are given significant attention, and they appear as models or warnings of what both good and failed discipleship are. Peter's like both. I'll follow you to the grave, right? I mean, I'll never leave you and depart from you. And then he fails. Other figures in the book include the Pharisees, the scribes, the chief priests, and other opponents. You have crowds, unnamed crowds, individuals encountered in healings or confrontation. But the main focus of the entire gospel is Jesus, his ministry, his suffering, his death, his resurrection, and his discipleship of the 12 apostles. That's the key theme here, right? So then we get to the big question. What is Mark's gospel? Because it's the shortest gospel, it skips over many details contained in other gospels, such as the birth narrative. Instead, it presents a fast paced, action oriented narrative biography of Jesus. It begins with John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism, his temptation, and moves through the Galilean ministry at breakneck speed, providing a few examples of Jesus performing miracles and teaching and speaking parables, having conflicts with the religious leaders, and his journey to Jerusalem. It culminates with a detailed passion narrative, the crucifixion, his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and a resurrection account. Right? Now, there's a debate over how Mark ends. Some of the earliest manuscripts, the Gospel Mark ends at chapter 16, verse 8. And some scholars think verses 9 to 20 are added by a later scribe. Other people think that 9 to 20 were accidentally left off during the copying phases, and the shorter version got copied more often, or just preserved. There's nothing profoundly theological in 9 through 20. Some churches talk about the handling of serpents and stuff, the deadly serpents, and they get off on it, but there's nothing. It doesn't matter to me whether 9 to 20 is authentic or not. It doesn't change the gospel. And as I explained under the who question, Mark is recording Peter's words. This is Peter's gospel as written down by Mark. And that's important as we go through this, to keep that in mind. But one thing I keep hearing on the internet is that the earliest gospel, some people think it's Mark. I've taken a position that Matthew wrote first, but modern scholarship tends to think Mark is the earliest gospel. And one of the reasons for the earliest gospel is they said it doesn't contain a high Christology. It's this idea that the Gospel of Mark doesn't present Jesus as God in human flesh, and that idea doesn't develop until John writes his gospel years later. This is complete bullpucky, but that lie is repeated often online. And if you're not familiar with Wesley Huff from Apologetics Canada, I came to know him when he was invited on to debate Billy Carson. And Billy Carson is somebody, a huckster, that's been out peddling nonsense all over the internet for years. and Wesley Huff was invited on, and in a very polite but educated means, Wesley Huff destroyed Billy Carson and probably destroyed his career as a huckster in a short program. And that was my first exposure to Wes Huff. I then seen him come out later and correct some things he said in that program, and that raised my view of Wesley Huff because he had no reason to come out and say he won the debate, so to speak. He won the day. He got fame out of it. There was nothing other than a dedication to honesty to come out and say I misspoke when I said this, and I was talking off my head, and I said this wrong. That shows credibility to me. I've then become a fan of Wes Huff, and then he said things like I stole his phrase. He says, "When the Bible whispers, I try not to shout." I think that's good advice. A lot of people major in the minors. When the Bible is pretty silent, they want to do it. And I'm a big fan of people like you know Michael Heiser. I'm a huge fan of Michael Heiser, but I cringe when he calls it a Deuteronomy 32 worldview, because Deuteronomy 32, he's basing it on a disputed version of that text, and then like Psalms 82. I happen to agree with Heiser. I think the Septuagint is the right version of Deuteronomy 32, and I think his interpretation of Psalm 82 is correct. But those are disputed passages and disputed interpretation. That's what I call whispering. I'm not building a worldview where the Bible whispers. And I think Wes Huff brings that to the conversation. But I listened to a video by him, and he said the Gospel of Mark contains material that asserts or implies Jesus is Yahweh, God and human, the God of Israel in human flesh, in every chapter. That's a bold claim, and I've seen a lot of apologists make bold claims that they couldn't back up before. So I went in, I tried to examine that claim independently. You know me, I'm the where's the beef guy. And Huss gives you some examples, but I said, let me just go see if I could do this and find it in every chapter. And then I wanted to cross verify, not just be it Bill find these, but do scholars have other scholars looked at that? Can I cross verify this? And there's a book by Richard Bachman, and it's called Jesus and the God of Israel, God Crucified, and Other Studies of the New Testament Christology and Divine Identity. You can see the books I read, their titles just roll right off your tongue, right? And then Mark Strauss wrote a commentary on Mark that at least is not as bad as Bachman's title. And what I found in those scholarly works is corroboration for Wes Huff's claim that it's there, and my own study that every chapter in the Gospel of Mark declares that Jesus is God in human flesh. That's pretty good for an early uh, gospel, right? Mark presents a high Christology in which Jesus repeatedly exercises prerogatives unique to Yahweh or in the Old Testament. Like Jesus forgives sins. Only God can forgive sins. He controls the creation or chaos, like Yahweh in the Psalms and the prophets. He speaks with eternal authority, receiving divine acknowledgement. Jesus receives titles with divine connotation. The Son of God, and it has Old Testament passages originally referring to Yahweh applied to him, like John's the declaration by John that Isaiah talks, and he quotes Isaiah about preparing the way of the Lord, and we miss it because in Isaiah, in Hebrew, it's not Lord, it's the name of God, it's a proper name of God. The messenger prepares the way of God, Yahweh. These elements appear in every chapter through their explicitness and concentrations. Their explicitness and concentrations vary. Some chapters are lighter, some chapters are heavier, some chapters are more explicit, and some chapters are more subtle. Some chapters feature dramatic theophany like miracles and direct claims, while others advance a portrayal in more subtler authority, like titles or scriptural allusions. The narrative cumulatively, in total, okay, portrays Jesus as sharing Yahweh's unique identity in human form, Yahweh incarnate, and it's consistent with early Christian high Christology. It is not a earlier uh, lower Christology that later morphed into the high Christology. You hear this from people like Bart Ehrman and other critics. That claim is complete crapola. Okay, this claim that the he's presented in every chapter, it aligns with the primary text. It's supported by scholars like Bachman and Strauss. However, it's not a series of explicit philosophical declarations like Jesus is Yahweh. You don't find that in any chapter, never mind every chapter. Rather, it's conveyed through actions, titles, Old Testament echoes, and responses from characters like disciples or demons or the Father or the crowds. The declarations are there if you're willing to see them. And in what portion of my introduction, I'm going to go through these for you. Right? And Mark 1 opens with the gospel according to the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And Mark 1:11 records the heavenly voice. That's the Father speaking from heaven in the voice at his baptism. You are my beloved Son, and with you I am well pleased. Echoing Psalm 2:7 and Isaiah 42:1. And if you go back and look up those verses, it's not talking about a human son. In Mark 1:2-3, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord and make his path straight. The Lord here combines both Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 40 verse 3, where it refers to Yahweh in both passages. But Mark here is applying Yahweh to Jesus via John the Baptist preparing the way for him. This is an incredibly strong statement that Jesus is Yahweh or Jehovah. Pronounce those 4 letters any way you want. Jehovah is probably closer to the original pronunciation, but Mark 2:5 and 7 and 10 records Jesus saying to the paralytic man, Son, your sins are forgiven. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Jesus responds by claiming authority that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins and healing a man. Forgiving sins a prerogative of Yahweh alone in the Old Testament in Isaiah 43:25 and Psalm 103:3. But the Son of Man has that prerogative because the Son of Man is Yahweh. And when we look at Daniel passage about the Son of Man being given, that all authority in heaven and earth was given to him. And Mark 2:28 adds the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, asserting authority over institutions established by God. God established the Sabbath, but Jesus claims to be the Lord of that Sabbath. That's a claim of divinity, of equalness with Yahweh. Mark 3:11. Note that whenever the unclean spirit saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, You are the Son of God. The demons know him. Supernatural beings not only recognize him, but they submit to Jesus and his divine identity. Jesus also exercises authority to appoint the 12, heal, and consistent with divine power. Right? And Mark 4:39-41 describes Jesus as rebuking the wind and the sea. He says, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. The disciples asked, Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And this echoes Yahweh's unique power over creation and chaos in Psalms 107 and 89, in Genesis 1 and Job 38. And Strauss notes this as a theophany, revealing, what do you call it? Divine mastery over this stuff, right? I need to save something real quick. I made some edits right before I went online, and I noticed that Strauss is not highlighted here, so those edits are not in my slides. I just had to fix it. Mark 5:7 records the Gerasene demoniac crying, What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" The demons recognize him. It's a title evoking divine sovereignty. Jesus commands the legion of demons with the authority no human possesses. He heals by touch, reversing impurity in ways that align with divine holiness and power. Okay? Mark, if it's the earliest gospel, and I don't even think it is, but if it is, if you take that position, it presents a very high Christology in every chapter. Mark 6:49 to 51 describe Jesus as walking on the sea. Right? He walks on the water. And he's saying, "Take heart, it is I." But in the I here, it's in Greek, it's ego eimi. It is take heart, it is I am. Do not be afraid. He calms the wind, walking on the water, and uses the I am phrase, evoking the Old Testament theophanies of Yahweh in Job 9:8, Isaiah 43:18, and more specifically, Exodus 3:14. The I am statement, the angel of the Lord speaking from the burning bush. Psalm highlights this as divine self-revelation. In Mark 7:19, on the context of the discussion on clean and unclean notes parenthetically that Jesus declared all foods clean. Wait a second, didn't God alone declare some clean and unclean, but Jesus declares it? He asserts authority to redefine and fulfill Mosaic purity laws in a manner reserved for God. God is the lawgiver. Jesus also heals across boundaries with divine compassion and power. Mark 8:29 records Peter's confession, "You are the Christ." The Christ is the Greek for Messiah, right? You're the anointed one. Jesus then predicts his suffering, death, and resurrection with divine foreknowledge and authority in Mark 8:31, rebuking Peter sharply. This redefines messiahship on divine terms. Mark 9:2-7 describes the transfiguration where Jesus is transfigured with divine glory. Moses and Elijah appear, and the voice from the clouds declares, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." This is a theophany echoing Sinai, Exodus 24, and affirming divine sonship and authority. Right? So far, we're in every chapter. We're 9 chapters in Mark. Every chapter is declaring Jesus to be God in human flesh. Mark 10 has Jesus responding. I think that should be plural. I mean, ing, not plural. To being called good teacher by saying, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." In this context, this highlights divine uniqueness while Jesus proceeds to exercise authority on marriage, rooted in creation, right? And states that the purpose of the Son of Man is to give his life for the ransom of many, right? In Mark 10:45. And that echoes Isaiah 53. Mark 11:15-17 records Jesus cleansing the temple and quoting Isaiah 56:7 It is it not written, my house shall be called the house of prayer for all nations? He claims authority over the temple, Yahweh's house, the triumphal entry, fulfilling Zechariah 9:9. It presents him as the coming king with divine endorsement. In Mark 12:35 to 37, has Jesus asked about Psalm 110:1. David himself in the Holy Spirit declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies at your feet. David himself calls him Lord, so how is it that he is his son? Okay? This shows the Messiah is both David's human descendant and David's divine Lord. In the Greek kurios that we is Lord in our New Testament, it's used for the proper name of Yahweh in the Old Testament, implying, like in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament that's in Greek, implying more than mere humanity. The parable of the tenants in Mark 12:1 to 12 portray Jesus as the beloved son sent by the owner, right? Who they kill. This just goes on and on. Mark 13:31 records Jesus saying, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. This claims eternal, unchanging authority for his words, paralleling description of God's word in Isaiah 48. The entire Olivet Discourse asserts divine knowledge and sovereignty over future events. Mark 14:61 and 62 has Jesus under oath before the high priest, and he affirms, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with clouds in heaven. The I am, ego ami, echoes Exodus 3:14, Yahweh's self-revelation of when asked his name, combined with Daniel 7:13 about the Son of Man and Psalm 110 imagery of divine enthronement and judgment. And Strauss and others note this as a climatic divine claim. And you see that the priest recognizes it as it because he says, we don't need any more witnesses. We heard it right out of his mouth. Right? Mark 15, 38 and 39 described a temple curtain torn in two from top to bottom, signifying divine access at Jesus' death, followed by the centurion's confession. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Supernatural signs entitled affirm divine identity even in suffering and death. So when the next time you hear somebody tell you that Mark presents a low Christology or that the idea that Jesus was God was a later development in the church, you have these passages to go tell them you don't know what you're talking about. Mark 16:6 records an announcement at the empty tomb. He is risen, he is not here. The young man in white, the heavenly messenger, angel, right, points to the fulfillment of Jesus' predictions. The resurrection vindicates all his prior claims about divine authority and identity. Okay? And I did this when I looked at the proof for Jesus is that he is who he says, because the resurrection validates all his other claims. And I provided specific examples from every chapter supporting the claim that the text consistently presents Jesus through his actions, his titles, his Old Testament allusions, which are best explained by his sharing the unique identity and prerogatives of Yahweh in human flesh. This isn't forced eisegesis. I'm not reading into the text, but it flows from the narrative. Scholarly sources like Bachman affirm his divine identity framework for Mark, while Strauss details many of the theophanic and authoritative elements. I had to use them both to get it all in here. Dissenting scholarly perspective exists which emphasize Jesus as the divine agency rather than full identity and highlight a nuance, but they do not negate the primary textual evidence for a high Christology from the Gospel of Mark itself. Okay? It's not that Jesus isn't there. So the what question is of Mark is it presents Jesus as God in human flesh. That's the what. It presents him as the suffering servant, the Messiah, the coming King, the Lord. Mark presents him as God, and that this is something that is being denied by a bunch of people that think they know what they're talking about on the internet. And I am frustrated with them. I'm frustrated with the false prophets and false teachers and people out peddling nonsense. That's why I was listening to California Michael going through First John, and I love the Gospel of John, but I can identify with John, the older John that wrote First, Second, Third John. He's been in Ephesus dealing with Gnostics and pagan goddess worshippers and stuff for decades. Okay, he's there trying to establish the church. The church at Ephesus is going to become one of the biggest, stronger centers for Christianity by the late first century. Bigger than Jerusalem, Rome. Ephesus is it in the second, third century. It is a massive stronghold of the church. It was a pagan center. But Paul sends Timothy, and John goes there as an apostle, and they conquer that city for Christ. But it didn't come easily. They didn't just walk in and everybody fell down and started worshiping. It's not like Jonah going to Nineveh. Everybody put on sackcloth and ashes and repented. He fought him. He was fighting him every day. And after a while, you get tired of this fight. And the older John doesn't have time for the nonsense. And he calls him out. The younger John, in my opinion, the Gospel of John was written by John when he still had a youthful exuberance. A lot of people put the Gospel of John way later, like in the 80s AD. I think it's much earlier in his life because it has the impact of somebody writing earlier. But John's the last gospel written, and if I move John's gospel back earlier, then guess what? All the other gospels get earlier. And suddenly you don't have Mark writing in the you know Mark may have written in the 60s, but Matthew would have written much before him, and Matthew's gospel is earliest according to every early church father that writes on the subject. Matthew wrote first. I don't care about modern uh, theories that are sold to um, young uh, people going to seminary and Bible colleges that are told, oh, yeah, we have all this internal evidence that Mark wrote first and that they got it. I don't care about your theories. The people closest to the source, the people that some of them are very close to the source, who had more records than we have available to us, all affirm Matthew wrote first. That settles it for me. And Matthew writes, then Mark later, and Luke probably, um, since Luke is writing his gospel um, as a thing for what do you call it? I think as a friend of the court brief, kind of his Luke and Acts for Paul. I think both Luke and Mark are written before Peter's death, before Paul's death. Puts them back earlier than people think. And what we have here is contrary to the claims otherwise. The Gospel of Mark presents Jesus as God. And if you're new here and it's your first time, I don't usually look at the chat until I get finished with the going through my notes. And then I put on a song and I'll go back and what do you call it? I will read the chat and I'll come back and talk to you after. So with that, I'll see you in just a minute.
No, you've been trying to keep from crying. Blessed are they who weep. It's not in our power. No man knows the hour. Father, my heart is true. I will run to you. And it's hard to understand, but I'll trust there's a higher plan. And I fall on my knees, and I'm begging you, Jesus, please, to hold me and keep me warm, and shelter me from this storm. Lord, help me make it, 'cause my heart can't take it. This burden's too much to bear. The darkness is falling. There's a new day dawning. Comfort me, Lord. Please take all my pain away. And it's hard to understand, but I'll trust in my Master's plan. And I fall on my knees, and I'm begging you, Jesus, please, to hold me and keep me warm, and shelter me from this storm.
Okay. It took me a while to figure out with my mic that the mute switch is moving the. It goes mute when you lift it up. Very cool. But I was looking all over for the mute button. Rick Roll, thank you very much. That comment to me means a lot. He says the knowledge that this type of knowledge is what he's here for, and it's not what he typically gets in church. That's what I'm hoping to share with all of you. A type of knowledge about the Bible that you're not going to be taught in church. And honest to God, if even going to seminary, you're not going to get some of this stuff because you're going to get taught nonsense in some ways. And then you'll get good stuff, but you also some of these things like the Deutero-Isaiah theory and a JEDP theory about the authorship of the Pentateuch and other things in there. The Mark and priority, meaning that Mark wrote first. You'll be taught all that stuff. You can go to the most conservative school out there. I went to Biola University when I went back to take classes. A pretty conservative school, and they taught that stuff. I had a guest professor come in one day during the time they were doing the genetic Eve studies, which should date you that time I was in the class, that was there to present the idea that Adam and Eve weren't two literal people, that they were a population group. And he presented that was a conservative Christian college, university. You go to a less conservative one, it's even going to be worse. But what happens here is if you learn to study the Bible the way I'm teaching you and how to dig in the Bible itself, you can save yourself from a lot of this nonsense. And so the fact that you recognize that, Rick, and you made a comment really means a lot to me. It means a lot. And Sword, I see you over there on YouTube. I miss you, dude. I haven't talked to you in ages, and I'm hoping you're doing well. And Mr. Mountains, the other people on Rumble, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. There's a lot of places you could spend your time, and the fact that you choose to listen to some retired electrician talking about Jesus for an hour, 3 days a week, that's a big deal to me. And I don't take your time, uh, and I don't want to waste it. I don't want to treat your time as something that can be wasted. And I try to give you value for what you're at. And that doesn't mean that you owe me anything. I'm not here trying to tell you, well, I gave you all this information. Now send the check, right? That's not what I'm asking for. I don't do anything behind the paywall. I stream Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I was Donahue Papa when I first went online, and I had a half dozen accounts. Most of those accounts are gone. I'm down to Rumble and X as Donahue Papa. And then when I went over to pill.net, the foxhole, the little comfy bunker, and I so messed up Donahue Papa that when Methods helped me, we just started from scratch and made a new account as Bill Donahue. I wasn't ever going to go on YouTube, but when I finally broke down and went to YouTube, I couldn't get Donahue Papa. I couldn't get Discerning Truths. I couldn't get Bill Donahue. After about 10 tries, they made the suggestion of Discerning Truths 534, which is funny because I couldn't find 533 other Discerning Truths. I couldn't find any Discerning Truths plural. There's a Discerning Truth channel, but there was nobody that had my name that I asked for, and they still wouldn't give it to me. On Fridays, I joined Neil. I love Neil. I tease her. She doesn't like being called a teacher. I said, but she teaches by example. She reads through the Bible. She's hosting a Bible reading, and she thinks out loud about the text. What does that mean? She openly admits when she doesn't understand what a word means and goes looks it up. Okay? She checks multiple versions of the Bible to get a better understanding. What a great teaching by example for how to study the Bible. And then on Friday, we talk about whatever's on Neo's mind, whatever subject of the day. And I love that. I love that interaction. I have all my notes. I give you all those passages when Mark is there. After I go off the air, I'll create a PDF and I'll upload it on Discerning Truth Groups on Telegram. You can download it. Go on Telegram, find Discerning Truth Group, and download my notes for free. There's nothing I ever do is behind a paywall. You want to go back and listen? Rumble uses channels, right? So I was limited on how many channels I could make, so I made 14 because Rumble wants you treats every channel like they're independent. So I created a channel called New Testament Books, and that's where this will be. I have a Start Here channel, Old Testament books, a Doctrine and Dogma channel. YouTube, the one benefit of YouTube is it doesn't use channels and it uses playlists and there's no limit. So I will have a playlist on YouTube called Gospel Mark, really inventive name, and you're here. So you can check the replays out, use my notes, learn this material, share it with people. And then, like I said, always try to promote my good friend Michael Beatty in California. When I met Michael, he was a singer songwriter and he was a worship leader in a church. Him and I don't know how we never met while we were both at Calvary Chapel because we walked in the same circles and never met during our Calvary Chapel time. But then uh, we finally met when he was helping a pastor start a church in the town I had moved to, and uh, became friends and have stayed friends ever since. And God just keeps increasing his gifts. Like I said, he killed Deuteronomy, and he's doing a great job with First John. And he's a memer. He does a lot of political stuff. He does a lot of application. Not I focus more on interpreting the Bible. Michael is more on how to apply the Bible, how it applies in your life today. But he's there 7 days a week. Saturday is pre-recorded as just a proverb of the day. Sunday he's doing the Psalms with his wife Linda, and then the Monday through Friday he's going through books in the Bible. He usually bounces Old Testament to New Testament. I haven't asked him if he's going to do the first, second, third John together, or if he's going to go right back to the Old Testament. But he's just about to finish and First John. So with that, I'm going to get out of here. God bless you all. I hope you have a great week, and thank you for tuning in.